You can do it. You've got this, mate. You've got this. Absolutely not. You don't have this at all.
Avoidance. Press red to watch on BBC iPlayer.
Lucy, know your position.
I know my place.
Go on, Lucy, drive the ball.
My place is with the greats.
Up next, Nat Siver, the innovator.
Campbell seals her place in history.
My place is first place. My place is first place.
Our place
Is here.
This is BBC One. Now the BBC News at 10 with Huw Edwards.
Tonight at 10, a special report from the front line as Russian forces tighten their grip on eastern Ukraine. As desperate civilians try to flee the city of Lysychansk.
But scorched earth.
And in neighbouring Severodonetsk, the Russians have virtually cut off the city from the rest of Ukraine. We'll have compelling new accounts of the progress being made by President Putin's forces. Also tonight.
We fight back!
Despite loud protests, the Court of Appeal gives the go-ahead for the first flight taking asylum seekers to Rwanda. Taking goods from Britain to Northern Ireland. How the UK government proposes to scrap parts of the Brexit deal it signed.
From Rwanda to Brexit, the government taking on the courts at home and facing accusations abroad of breaking international law.
And a world first in the field of biology, mapping the genome sequence of every species in the British Isles.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News channel, tantalisingly poised, England set up.
Very warm welcome to BBC News at 10 in Heartland, the region of the Donbass. President Zelensky has called again for Western allies to provide advanced missile defence systems for the Ukrainian army to stop the steady Russian advance. The Russians now control almost all of the strategic city of Severodonetsk after lots of fighting, and tonight the final bridge to that city has been destroyed, trapping Ukrainian troops and thousands of civilians. The Ukrainian government, by the way, says that Russia is able to keep up all of this military activity for one reason, because it is still earning huge amounts by selling oil and gas, despite the global economic sanctions. Well, the Russians are also bombarding the neighbouring city of Lysychansk, where civilians are desperately trying to flee. Our international correspondent Ola Girin with video journalist Colm Malloy have sent this report from the Donbass.
Max speed.
We're told to drive at maximum speed on the exposed road to Lysychansk. A dark horizon greets us. Residents praying. Ukrainian troops call for help to take away one more victim of Russian shelling. Nearby, the rush to evacuate civilians who have to duck for cover. A panicked departure in an armoured truck. Well, people are taking this chance to get out while they can, but they know this could be a one-way journey. If the Russians take this territory, and they're getting closer all the time, these people may never be able to come back to their city and their homes. The situation is critical, a rescue worker says, hoping to outrun moving front lines. Volodymyr is among them. He's sick and headed to hospital. He tells me that life here was calm until the war broke everything apart. and it has left its terrible mark. This was the Palace of Culture, now standing as grim testament to Moscow's superior firepower. Ukraine's president says Lysychansk is already dead, along with neighbouring Severodonetsk, ghost cities now. Well, this is an example of the kind of devastation that Russia has brought. It's not just destroying apartment buildings and flats and homes, it's destroying history and the fabric of cities. And this is a deliberate tactic: bomb, shell, burn, and leave nothing but scorched earth. Those who remain make brief escapes from their basements to cook outdoors. The city has no power or running water. But Yelena still clings to her home, despite the growing threat. Do you think the Russians will take the city soon? It seems like they're getting close.
Я не знаю ничего, я вам не могу сказать.
I don't know, she says.
Все будет нормально.
We're hoping it'll be okay. But the city is running out of time. This is now an artillery war. Ukraine doesn't have enough big guns or ammunition. At the 11th hour, another plea for help.
My message and message of Ukrainian people, I think we need victory, we need peace, and we cannot get a peace and a victory without help our partners. Because without equipment for our artillery, I think we cannot get a victory in this terrible war.
As we spoke, the war came closer.
But
that was a Russian shell whistling over our heads. Just a short distance away, neighbouring Severodonetsk is burning and may soon fall. Inside the city, the last pockets of resistance. Ukrainian troops fight building to building and street. Ukraine is facing an enemy that has learned lessons and is imposing crushing losses in battle. Troops fight on, but the handful of advanced weapon systems promised by Britain and the US may be too little, too late. Here in the Donbass region right now, it looks like a losing battle. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Eastern Ukraine.
Let's turn then to the day's other main story, which is that earlier this evening, Boris Johnson published his highly controversial plans to give ministers the power to get rid of parts of the Brexit deal that he signed with the EU. The Prime Minister basically wants to change what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol to make it easier for some goods to move between Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, the EU says that these planned changes are simply not acceptable and that they break international law. So let's look at the plans and explain a little about what's behind them. What we need to focus on, of course, is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which, just let's repeat and underline, is in the European Union. Hence the need for checks on goods. Now, basically, the frontier needs to be kept trouble-free, tension-free. It's really an area that's been full of trouble in the past, and really part of the peace process was to keep it in a place where friction was reduced to a minimum. No checks there. Well, if there are no checks there, where do they take place? Well, basically, between the British Isles and between Northern Ireland, between Britain and Northern Ireland itself. That's the rub here. Now, that was the deal agreed by Boris Johnson. It's a deal he now doesn't want and wants to change because the Unionists in Northern Ireland also detest the deal. They see it as dividing the UK. So what's on the table now? A green lane. That's what Boris Johnson's come up with in his government. A green lane for goods that are destined only for Northern Ireland. They're not going to the EU. They wouldn't need any checks. And then a separate lane, a red lane, for those goods which are going through Northern Ireland but destined for the European Union. There'd be checks on those goods. So does this alternative plan stand a chance of passing muster with the EU? It doesn't look as if that's the case. We'll talk about that in a second. First, this report from our political editor, Chris Mason.
Brexit is about borders, about different rules either side of them. But borders usually separate one country from another, and yet here in Belfast there is a border, checks, when goods arrive here from the rest of the UK. Those checks happen because of a deal the government signed up to. But now it doesn't like what this means for Northern Ireland.
People can't access the goods they need to access. We're not able to implement the same tax benefits in Northern Ireland as we are for the people of Great Britain. So this is a very serious issue that we need to fix. We have sought a negotiated settlement for the last 18 months, but as yet the EU have been unwilling to change the terms of the protocol.
And they've not changed their mind today either.
No workable alternative solution has been found to this delicate, long negotiated balance. Any renegotiations would simply bring further legal uncertainty for the people and businesses in Northern Ireland. For these reasons, the European Union will not renegotiate the protocol.
So what impact does the protocol have on people in Northern Ireland? Beth runs a garden centre in Ballynahinch in County Down.
A lot of the growers don't want to get involved with the paperwork. I think it's made things harder. You're trying to get stock from different sources.
But others, like the meat and dairy industries who sell goods to the EU, say it's made trading easier.
We would see the protocol as something to build on. We would be concerned about anything that damages trade, particularly into, obviously the risk here is trade into Europe.
It's worth remembering how we got here. The Prime Minister was on a farm in Hale in Cornwall this morning and was asked,
Have you driven any other tractors?
I've driven a lot of tractors in my... Yeah, I have.
Indeed, he has. This, an election stunt not burdened with subtlety back in 2019. He won the election and did deliver Brexit. But with the protocol attached, it's had profound political consequences in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin regard overriding elements of it irresponsible. The Democratic Unionists won't go back into devolved government unless it changes.
I believe that finally we are now seeing the kind of action that is required to begin the process of removing the barriers to trade within the United Kingdom.
It does nothing to serve the interests of the people here. It flies in the face of an international agreement which he himself negotiated. It is in clear breach of international law. And it is, the reality is here that the protocol is working.
This has just been... I asked this Tory MP if he thought all of this was about the turbulence within the Conservative Party and questions over the Prime Minister's future.
Oh, I think you can construct a very compelling case to make that argument. I'd like to say I hope it's not true.
But you think it might be?
As I say, you can construct a very compelling case to make that argument.
To be Prime Minister is to be a diplomat.
Are you breaking international law, Prime Minister?
Boris Johnson met his Portuguese counterpart this afternoon. Shaking hands on a solution to his Northern Ireland Brexit conundrum won't happen so easily. Huw, the government says it's been left with no option but to act. It does believe it is operating within international law. It says it's got to do whatever it possibly can to try and get devolved government back up and running in Northern Ireland. And yes, the Democratic Unionists did sound pretty positive today, but it's a big jump from today to them going back in to Stormont. And turning the plan today into a law will take time. And in the meantime, a row with the EU.
Chris, many thanks. Chris Mason there with the latest analysis at Westminster. And Chris there, of course, mentioning that really now we're all looking at the response from the EU to see what they have to say. So let's join Katya Adler, our Europe editor in Brussels. No secret, Katya, that basically the EU is not keen on these changes. But what action is open to them?
Well, I can tell you, Huw, where we're not hurtling towards straight away, and that's an all-out trade war between the EU and the UK. There's really little appetite amongst EU leaders for that. They've got their hands full already with their own cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine. So today, the EU didn't want to overreact to the government's proposed legislation. I mean, it's not law yet, but it didn't want to underreact either. It is seen here as extremely serious that the government seeks to have powers to override large parts of the protocol that it co-wrote and signed off with the EU. So as a warning, the EU this week is looking to restart legal proceedings against the UK for not implementing checks on certain goods it says it should do under the protocol. But at the same time, Huw, this evening, we heard from the EU's chief negotiator in the Commission, who said he's about to unveil a whole load of new proposals to iron out those practical problems in Northern Ireland that have been provoked by the protocol. Come back to the negotiating table, he says to the EU. And in fact, when you look at issues like customs lanes and things like that, you know, the two sides, Huw, aren't really that far apart. It's just the mood music right now is dreadful.
Katya, many thanks again for the latest thoughts there in Brussels. Katya Adler, our Europe editor. Quick reminder for you, you can find plenty of updates, more news, more analysis from Katya, Chris Mason and colleagues on BBC News Online. That's bbc.co.uk/news. And of course, you can use the BBC News app on your mobile device. Judges at the Court of Appeal have ruled that the first flight to Rwanda taking migrants who've arrived illegally in Britain can take off tomorrow. The judges supported a previous decision by the High Court that it was in the public interest for the government to carry out its policies. It's reported that there will be 8 asylum seekers on that first flight. Our home editor Mark Easton has the story.
Dozens more asylum seekers arrived on the Kent coast today. 37 men who the government says should potentially face removal to Rwanda because they've travelled from France, a safe country. And this is the Boeing 767 chartered by the Home Office to take the first group of asylum seekers on a one-way ticket to Rwanda tomorrow night. The plane can take around 200 passengers, but a maximum of just 8 asylum seekers will be aboard, and 3 of those are in court tomorrow, arguing to be removed from the passenger list. The Rwanda policy divides opinion, apparent outside the courts of justice today. For some, it's an effective way to deal with migrants who come to the UK illegally. For others, it's an immoral and unlawful way to treat vulnerable people who are asking the UK for sanctuary.
To stay removal of asylum seekers to...
Lawyers were making a last-ditch attempt in the Court of Appeal to stop tomorrow's Rwanda flight, but the 3 judges, led by Lord Justice Singh, decided there was not enough to overturn last week's decision to let the plane take off.
This court cannot therefore interfere with that conclusion.
Campaigners were disappointed by the judgment, but there will be a full legal review of the Rwanda policy in the courts to be completed by the end of July.
We hope the courts in July in that longer hearing will take a different view, because it's a fundamentally unlawful policy. Claiming asylum is a human right, and Rwanda is not a safe country to which people can be returned.
This deal, for so many different reasons.
In the Rwandan capital, Kigali, today, the accommodation for those asylum seekers given the one-way ticket to Africa was receiving final touches: soap and shampoo sets, clean linen. The UK government says the arrangement is a model the rest of the world could follow. The Home Secretary has always argued that her Rwandan removals policy is designed to deter people from taking dangerous and unnecessary journeys from safe countries and will undermine the criminal operations of people smugglers. It is in the public interest, she says. Demonstrators gathered outside the Home Office this evening to protest against tomorrow's Rwanda departure. But ministers believe that even if only a single asylum seeker is aboard, the flight could be a game changer in dealing with what they call illegal immigration. Mark Easton, BBC News, at the Court of Appeal.
The family of a 12-year-old boy who's in a coma with severe brain damage say they're planning to appeal against a ruling that his treatment should be stopped. Doctors at the Royal London Hospital say tests have shown that Archie Battersby has no discernible brain activity, but his parents want his treatment to continue.
I do not believe Archie has been given enough time. From the beginning, I have always thought, what is the rush? His heart is still beating. He has gripped my hand. And as his mother, and my gut instinct, I know my son is still there.
Holly Dance there, who's Archie Battersby's mother. Now, the UK economy shrank in April for the second month in a row. All the main sectors of the economy, services, manufacturing and production, were affected. And some economists say the UK now risks falling into recession. The government says it's focused on boosting growth. So there's plenty to talk about with our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's joined me now in the studio. And when people look at these very disappointing growth figures, Faisal, and ask you for maybe a list of causes, what do you say to them?
Well, the first thing, this is actual data for April. As you say, you'll see that the figure is down 0.3% in that month. That was the same month, of course, when energy bills spiked so much by those record amounts, and we also got tax rises. The government's pointing to what actually pushed that negative, though, was the reduction in COVID NHS spending. But even if you take that into account, it's looking quite flat. But we tend to look at data over a run of months, not just in a single month, and you'll see the last time it grew was in January, and then it's been no growth since then. And indeed, if you take the National Institute's forecast for May and June, that continues. So basically, pretty likely that the economy is shrinking in this quarter, though not as bad as a recession just yet. We should be able to avoid that.
I suppose people will look at that and say, well, are other countries, comparable countries, facing the same kind of pressures? You know, how do we compare?
Well, they are facing the same pressures, but if you look into next year, then most of the forecasts are saying that UK is going to suffer little or, in fact, no growth. This is the OECD's forecast, UK bottom of that league. US and France, just we've taken two examples there, growing 1.2, 1.4%. Still actually not exactly roaring ahead, but better than zero.
And looking ahead to the rest of this week, we're just on Monday, and thinking, well, what other announcements could come this week that might change our perceptions?
So we've got the jobs data tomorrow. That's been a rare bright spot in the data. But inflation is obviously the key thing on people's minds right now. 9%, 4-decade high, heading up to 10%, and the Bank of England will make a further interest rate decision on Thursday, looking likely to be a further rise. So you have this really high inflation. You also have that stagnation I was talking about. Stagnation and inflation is this term stagflation, and that makes it's quite difficult to go and rein in inflation at the same time as avoiding a recession. It requires a double act between the Bank of England and the government, but that does seem where we are right now.
Faisal, we'll talk again as the week goes on. Thank you very much. Faisal Islam, there, our economics editor. Let's look briefly then at some of the other stories making the news today. The actor Kevin Spacey will appear in court in London on Thursday after being charged with sexual offences against 3 men. He's accused of 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. Kevin Spacey has previously said he intends to prove his innocence. At the High Court, Cadwaladr, Mr Banks, a major donor to the Leave.eu campaign, sued Ms Cadwaladr over allegations that she'd made values freedom of speech. Mr Banks said he was likely to appeal against the judgment. A father left paralysed in the Manchester Arena bombing has conquered the summit of Africa's highest mountain in a wheelchair. Martin Hibbert launched the mission to scale Mount Kilimanjaro as he wanted to move mountains, he said. By the way, you'll be able to see Martin and hear his incredible story on the breakfast sofa tomorrow morning. Well, tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary of the deadly fire at Grenfell Tower in West London, in which 72 people lost their lives. And the problem of flammable cladding on blocks of flats is still an acute one. Around 1 million people could still be living in blocks of flats with dangerous cladding, despite the government and property developers pledging some £9 billion to put things right. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has more details.
The Grenfell fire, thousands more.
Councils and housing associations must remove dangerous cladding quickly.
Leaseholders should not have to worry about the cost of fixing historic safety defects that they didn't cause.
And we've also got to do better in future to ensure that everyone across this country can live their life in safety and in dignity in a home that is warm, decent and safe.
200 miles north of Grenfell, these social housing blocks in Salford are still being made safe. Work to remove says she can't keep warm in winter.
That's why we don't have the heating on.
Without the cladding, there's lower insulation and higher heating bills.
All the cold air, when the wind's blowing, comes all in here.
And your heating goes outside?
If you're on your own, which a lot are here, and you're only on one pension, you're thinking, how am I supposed to do this? I can't feed the meter and put a dinner on the table.
The Housing Association, which operates the estate, says it's helped residents with their increased costs. 5 years on from Grenfell, the government says its figures show that work has at least started on all local authority and housing association high-rise blocks. But you can see from the experience of Etna and her neighbours here in Salford how long that process can take. And in much of the private sector, where there are many more buildings, work is further behind.
I live what I would consider to be privileged lifestyle, and now I find myself in a situation where I am so utterly impotent.
Natalie Carter lives in East London. The developer which built her block has agreed to pay for recladding works. But Natalie says the ongoing disruption is causing real anguish.
I don't think people quite understand the emotional distress of having to live in a building where at any given point you feel you could die. There ought to be compensation. It has completely turned my life upside down.
45 developers have recently pledged to pay costs within the private sector. But there are other kinds of dangerous cladding than the type used on the Grenfell Tower, and work to get rid of that is barely underway. Judith Moritz, BBC News.
Now, in what is probably the most ambitious project ever undertaken in the field of biology, a team of scientists is planning to sequence the genomes of all forms of life in the British Isles, estimated to be some 70,000 species. And the project can transform how we understand the natural world, and there may well be benefits for humans in search of medicines and materials inspired by nature. Our science editor, Rebecca Morell, has been finding out more.
A close-up look at our weird and wonderful natural world. From a delicate sea creature called a brittle star to a hermit crab carrying a sea anemone on its back, and these bizarre animals known as mud owls. All of these creatures were scooped up just off the coast of Plymouth.
So you've got two worms here, and this one, it's almost made these overlapping scales of kind of sandy shell.
They're being collected for an ambitious new project to sequence the genomes of all life in the British Isles. Today, scientists are focusing on marine worms, known as polychaetes.
It's a big task with hundreds and hundreds of species, and we've got over 100 now, I think 120 odd species of polychaetes collected. It seems like a lot, but really it's just the beginning.
The plan is to sequence the DNA of every plant, animal and fungi in Britain and Ireland. That's about 70,000 species. And some are surprising. There's a type of microalgae that has 200 billion letters of DNA. That's more than 60 times bigger than the human genome. And the scientists plan to do this all by 2030. The DNA extraction is being carried out at the Wellcome Sanger Institute. The human genome was sequenced here 2 decades ago. That took years, but now a species can be completed in a few days.
When the human genome was sequenced, it changed the way we do human biology forever. It's really transformed how we see ourselves and how we work with our health and illness. And we want to make that possible for all of biology. So we want everybody working on any species or any group of species anywhere in the world able to have this ultimate foundation.
One genome that is now complete belongs to the badger. In Oxfordshire, as dusk falls, a family emerges from their set. Scientists say having their detailed genetic information is vital.
Getting the badger genome sequence is really important because we can see how badgers adapt to diseases, how they adapt to their environment, and how they interact with other species in their ecosystem.
Back onshore in Plymouth, the rock pools are full of surprises, but their genetic code could also help us to find nature-inspired medicines or material of life. Rebecca Morell, BBC News, Plymouth.
Time is 10:30, time for a look at the weather. And on a Monday, Matt, maybe a look ahead to the week that's coming up. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. It's worth having a look, actually, Huw, because so far this summer it's been a rather cool start as it is, but things are about to change. Our first quick hit of summer heat is on its way. It's there at the moment across parts of Spain and Portugal. Will build into southern France over the next few days. Temperatures widely above 40 degrees, but it's towards the end of the week that heat really shoots its way northwards. It's mainly going to be for England and Wales. Widely high 20s, low 30s as we head towards Friday. Notice Scotland, Northern Ireland don't quite get into the heat. Here, there's always going to be a bit more cloud, much like we saw across in the west of Scotland today. Rather grey skies, the chance of some rain. But it's that cloud tonight, which means some of the highest temperatures we found here. A bit of a damp start tomorrow, but further south with clearer conditions in rural parts could get down to around 4 or 5 Celsius. But let's take a closer look tomorrow, starting across the north, because that rain comes and goes across parts of northern and western Scotland throughout the day. Northern Ireland, southern Scotland, northern England, the odd passing shower, but most of you will stay dry with some sunny spells. Southern half of the UK tomorrow, well, other than the odd shower towards North Wales, most will stay dry. Bit of cloud around first thing. Notice how that breaks up, particularly across southern areas. Well, it'll be a blue sky afternoon. It's here, though, very high pollen levels and the highest of the temperatures widely around 20 to 25 degrees. Most places close to where it should be for June, although rather cool in the northwest of Scotland. Well, it'll be a blustery day and a blustery evening to come. Rain eases off. It pushes back in as we go here into Wednesday. Further rain at times, as we'll see later on in the west of